In this video, we're looking at the different options for financing sustainable hydropower projects in low-income countries. As a large-scale, low-carbon electricity generation technology, hydropower can be instrumental in supporting socioeconomic development and reducing poverty. However, hydropower projects have been criticized in the past for adverse social and environmental impacts. Despite recent developments in the understanding of how to develop hydropower projects sustainably, many projects still raise a range of valid concerns. Various publications such as the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol or the International Finance Corporation's Guide for Developers and Investors have sought to address these issues. Thus, this video starts from the position in which a government has decided that a sustainable hydropower project represents the least cost option for electricity development, and we consider ways in which such projects can be sustainably financed. In sub-Saharan Africa, only approximately 10% of hydropower potential has been harnessed. This is largely because hydropower projects are slow and costly to build, and there's a lack of capacity and financial resources. Using examples in Uganda, we discussed the potential options for financing large hydropower projects in low-income countries and the advantages and disadvantages of three different types of financing structures: fully public finance, public-private partnership model, and new types of bilateral finance. In this video, we'll show how each of these has worked in practice. Uganda is a landlocked country in East Africa, bordering Lake Victoria in the southwest. Approximately 3/4 of Uganda's 44 million citizens live in rural areas, and agriculture remains the primary source of livelihood. In 2018, only 43% of Ugandans had access to electricity. 10 years prior to this, it was just 15%. This recent increase is due in no small part to the development of large hydropower projects. We're focusing on 3 dams, all located on the White Nile, flowing from Lake Victoria north towards Egypt and the Mediterranean. The dams are Kira, Bujagali, and Isimba. First, Kira, a public sector-financed extension of the Nalubale hydropower project, located 2 kilometers downriver from the source of the White Nile in the city of Jinja. Nalubale was financed fully by the public sector under the British colonial government. Over half a century later, the plant is still operating, having been refurbished in the 1990s. Like Nalubale, Kira was also constructed with public sector financing, with concessionary loans to the Ugandan government from the World Bank, the Norwegian Agency for Development Assistance, and the Swedish International Development Agency. 10 kilometers downriver from Kira, we find our second case study, the 250 megawatt Bujagali project. This is an example of a public-private partnership, or a PPP. The Bujagali PPP has 3 main partners: the Ugandan government, the Uganda Electricity Transmission Company Limited, and Bujagali Energy Limited. Bujagali Energy Limited was a private sector company set up by the equity investors specifically for this project. Under a concession agreement with the Ugandan government, this company has a license to own and operate the Bujagali project for a 30-year period. After this period ends, the plant will transfer to Ugandan government ownership for the cost of $1. The Bujagali project was approved for development in 1994, but construction did not commence until 2007. When the project was commissioned in 2012, it doubled Uganda's electricity supply and demonstrated that large energy PPPs are possible, even in risky investment environments such as sub-Saharan Africa. However, during the 18-year period that it took for Bujagali to go from concept to commissioning, the cost of the project more than doubled to $1.3 billion. This meant that the price of electricity generated by the plant was higher than had been expected. Bujagali has some features that are highly typical of PPPs and some that are not. In terms of typical features, first, BEL, the private sector company, was set up solely for the purpose of developing and operating the Bujagali plant. Second, the equity investors, who are Bujagali Energy Limited's shareholders, include a mixture of private sector entities and the Ugandan government. Third, the debt needed to finance the hydropower project was issued directly to Bujagali Energy Limited rather than the Ugandan government. This debt came from a mixture of different sources, including the International Finance Corporation, the private sector window of the European Investment Bank, several bilateral organizations, and 4 commercial banks. To reduce the risks to the private investors and lenders, partial risk guarantees and political risk insurance were issued by international financing institutions, in addition to the Ugandan government's sovereign guarantee. What is perhaps less typical is that the project was split into two: a PPP-financed hydropower dam and a separate interconnection project to transmit and distribute the electricity within Uganda, including extension of the existing grid to previously unserved areas. Unlike the hydropower project, the interconnection project was fully funded by the public sector, with concessional finance from the African Development Bank as well as the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Also unusual was the decision by the Ugandan government in 2018 to support the refinancing of Bujagali to bring down the cost of electricity tariffs and make it more affordable to Ugandan consumers. This involved more than $400 million in loans being refinanced. At the same time, SN Power, a Norwegian hydropower company, became the majority shareholder. Our third example is the 183 megawatt Isimba hydropower project, located some 40 kilometers downriver from Bujagali. In 2013, under pressure to further increase the country's electricity generation capacity, the Ugandan government was disinclined to embark on another project requiring lengthy PPP negotiations. Instead, they sought to finance the project through a new form of bilateral finance, which was becoming increasingly popular in sub-Saharan Africa at the time. Compared to Bujagali, the financing structure for Isimba is simple. Instead of a special purpose company with multiple shareholders, the Ugandan government is the sole equity shareholder. 85% of the costs were provided by a concessionary loan from the China Exim Bank. This loan was issued directly to the Ugandan government in the form of preferential export buyer's credit. The loan carried an interest rate of 2%, with a repayment period of 20 years after a 5-year grace. Under the conditions of the loan, the government of Uganda needed to award the project to Chinese contractors, as is usual with export credit finance. The vast majority of the materials and technologies used in the construction would likewise need to be sourced from China. The simple financing structure enabled quick financial closure, after which the construction was completed in 5 years. When the Isimba plant started generating electricity in 2018, the total cost of the project was estimated at approximately $568 million. However, the construction of Isimba was not accompanied with an interconnection project to expand grid connections. Instead, power from Isimba is transmitted to the national grid through the Bujagali substation. So here we are, 3 dams, 3 financing structures. Do we have a good, a bad, and an ugly? Or do we simply have 3 different approaches, each with its own set of strengths and weaknesses? Let's briefly explore the pros and cons of each model. First, fully public sector finance projects. This approach dominated the large hydropower sector for decades. Until the end of the 20th century, the vast majority of large hydropower projects were financed primarily or exclusively by the public sector in both developed and developing countries. In developing countries, a large share of the cost came from aid agencies, development finance institutions, and multilateral development banks. These loans were traditionally low interest and often also included a grant element. Development was, however, constrained by the availability of these funds and the ability of the least developed countries to absorb more debt. Since 2000, the availability of these funds has further declined, and energy projects are expected to be financed by the private sector and paid for from electricity tariffs. Moving on to public-private partnerships. These have many benefits. First and foremost, they enable new projects to be developed in situations where some public funds are available, but these are not sufficient to cover the entire cost of a large project. In the case of Bujagali, the Ugandan government was able to double the country's electricity supply through an investment of less than 15% of the total project cost. MDB involvement also ensured that international good practice guidelines were followed in both social and environmental impact assessment. The main disadvantage of the PPP model is that the large number of parties involved can delay or derail the process. The need to follow international good practice, while essential to ensure a sustainable outcome, can also be slow and costly. In some instances, problems in securing legal agreements, such as power purchase agreement, can cause further delays and result in higher costs. These cost increases, in turn, can result in higher electricity tariffs, as happened with Bujagali. Turning to new bilateral finance, the main advantage of this model is that it is simple, making the process much faster to arrange than PPPs. The resulting project may thus be cheaper and potentially allow for lower electricity tariffs. The new bilateral finance approach is simple from a contractual point of view. The loan is made directly to the host country government, who will own the project from the beginning. There is no privately owned company, which means that there is no need for a power purchase agreement or a concession agreement to reach financial closure. However, this type of financing comes with conditions and constraints that can have long-term implications for the projects and the host country. Because the financing is tied to the source country's contractors, the host country government has limited choice over materials and technologies. This limits the scope for competitive procurement and reduces transparency. New bilateral financing arrangements can also allow international, environmental, and social protection requirements to be circumvented if the government lacks capacity to regulate and enforce international standards. Also, governments need to assume the operational risk of the project, for which they may lack capacity. New bilateral finance is not always issued on concessionary terms and can increase a country's debt burden to unmanageable levels. Uganda's experiences of developing large hydropower with various different types of financing can provide examples to other low-income countries where much of the hydropower potential remains underutilized. In addition to providing their energy benefits, sustainably developed hydropower projects can help countries to adapt to changing climate by providing much-needed water management services, including seasonal water storage. If large projects could secure sustainable finance, then low-income countries could realize huge development benefits, reduce poverty, and support economic growth.